With Us Connect. I'm Tamir, the Stand With Us Israel Associate Director here in the Israel office based in Jerusalem. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are around the world. It's really exciting to connect with you. Today we're coming to you live with Stand With Us Connect, our brand new webinar series. It inspires us and me in person to see tens of thousands of views to these videos every single week. So thank you for helping our community grow. Stand With Us, as you may know, has been at the forefront of getting Israel education to people around the world through leaflets, brochures, physical sessions, and online sessions on a daily basis. Stand With Us Connect, this platform, is our way of connecting Israel around the world and bringing Israel to your home. Now, in a moment, I will introduce you to our guest speaker today, but just before that, if you like our webinars and what you're seeing online, you can book your own private webinar for your groups, your churches, synagogues, and families, and we will deliver the session for you. So go to www.standwithusconnect.com. Now for this webinar, you can ask questions. So just post your questions in the comment section below, either on Facebook Live or Zoom. Don't forget to tell us your name and where you're from so we can pick up on that. Now, one last thing before we start. If you're passionate about Israel and enjoy our programming, please consider supporting us and donating to our work at Stand With Us at www.standwithus.com/donate. Now for today's session's name is Fighting Anti-Semitism. It's a special lecture with an expert in this field from Stand With Us who deals with this on a daily basis, Carly Gammill. Carly is the director of the Stand With Us Center for Combating Antisemitism. Carly is a seasoned constitutional litigator with extensive experience handling matters involving free speech and religious liberties and fighting anti-Semitism, including the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic BDS campaigns, whether on campus, in court, and at the UN. Carly's work in combating anti-Semitism derives in part from her background in the education field, as well as from a deep personal conviction that the world, including people of other races and religions, cannot afford to stand by silently while the Jewish people are once again targeted, marginalized, demonized, and harmed. Carly, it's an honor to welcome you to Stand With Us Connect. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tamir. And I just want to say, as Tamir did, that this is really an encouraging thing to know how many people are tuning into these. And so it is my pleasure and my privilege to be able to be here with everyone from around the globe today. Again, as Tamir said, I am by practice a litigator. I am, again, privileged to be able to do what I'm doing now and to incorporate a little bit of my legal background into the education that I'm doing for Stand With Us, primarily about anti-Semitism. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Yes, it's a heavy topic, and I understand that the world has a lot of heaviness going on right now, and unfortunately, anti-Semitism hasn't taken a break during this time. In many ways, it's actually seen a spike. And so what we're going to talk about is what we're seeing. I'm going to put it in a little bit of a legal framework, just so that there's a little bit of an understanding of what some of the legal options are and how that works. I will be talking largely about US law, so I realize that we've got people from around the world, and it may or may not apply, and I'll try to kind of acknowledge that. But anyway, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some practical ideas, some things that you can do. You know, just because you don't work for an organization whose mission is to combat anti-Semitism doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can be doing that are extremely helpful and persuasive and meaningful in this fight. And so, so that's where we're going to go. Let me see if I can switch over here so that you can see where we're headed here. All right. All right, so let's just get right into the best way, I think, to deal with addressing anti-Semitism. Again, not everyone is steeped in this the way that those of us at Stand With Us are. So we need to first define it. The definition that I'm going to be using, that I'm going to start with anyway, it's a consensus international definition, and it was adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as well as over 30 separate democratic nations. And it simply says this, that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. And then goes on to talk about how rhetorical and physical manifestations are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals, their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. The really great thing about this definition, I think, is that the IHRA and the member nations that came up with this definition, they didn't stop at this short little definition. They actually provided a number of contemporary examples of what anti-Semitism might look like. And it's important to remember that, and we're going to walk through just a few of them, but it's important to remember that it doesn't mean that anytime one of these things occurs, that it is necessarily a manifestation of anti-Semitism. You do have to take into context all of the factors, the entire context of a situation, but these are extremely helpful when we're trying to figure out, might a situation actually be anti-Semitic? So let's look at some of these examples. Calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or, view of religion. That's one that we've seen through the years. We also have making dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews or the power of Jews. Myths about Jews controlling various aspects of society, right? Or accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for things that an individual Jewish person may have done, or that a non-Jew may have done, or someone completely unrelated to the Jewish people, but accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for those kinds of things. And that's something that I think, if anyone has been watching the news or has been, more importantly, online during this time, which I think all of us have been more than we normally are, we see this third manifestation happening quite a bit, and there has been a spike in that happening. Some of these examples then go on and they have to do with Holocaust denial, accusing Jews of exaggerating the Holocaust, things like that. And then I'll just quickly run through a couple more, because especially this first one on the screen is going to become important when we talk a little bit later. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And so that's going to come up again in a little bit. And then, like I said, you can kind of quickly look at some of these other examples, and we can make this available. And in fact, we already have made it available, I should mention, on the Stand With Us website, as well as on the Center for Combating Antisemitism separate website. We have resources available in the form of educational booklets. And so this is actually one of the booklets that we have that includes this entire definition with these examples. And so you certainly can go there and read those, take a little more time beyond what we have here today. Excuse me, I want to go back. I want to talk for a few minutes about anti-Zionism. And you may have heard this statement or this expression, that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. And it takes a little bit of unpacking, I think, for us to understand exactly what that means and what anti-Zionism is. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with anti-Semitism. In the first instance, in order to understand this topic, we have to start with a definition, right? We have to know, well, what even is Zionism? And it can be a confusing thing, but the reality is it doesn't have to be. So here's the way that I think we can best do this. I think the way that we define Zionism, first we have to talk about what it's not. And the reason that I say that is because there is confusion that comes in. And sometimes you hear that Zionism, for example, is a political movement that led to the creation of the political state of Israel that began with Theodore Herzl. That's a manifestation of Zionism. But that in and of itself is not what Zionism is. Sometimes you might hear that Zionism is just support for the state of Israel. Again, that's a manifestation of Zionism, but that in and of itself doesn't encompass Zionism. So I'll give you my definition of Zionism, and then we'll go from there. So Zionism is the centuries-old longing of the Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland, to which they are indigenous, and to exercise their right of self-determination there in the same way that other people groups are able to do. That's what Zionism is. Again, it's not a new thing. It's not a political movement. It is a longing of the Jewish people to live and exercise their right of self-determination in their ancestral homeland, which is Israel. The reality is, if we understand it that way, Zionism is actually, it's an integral component of Jewish identity for many people. It's not an opinion or a belief. It's an actual part of Jewish identity for many Jews, in the same way that some Jews may express their Jewish identity by keeping kosher or by observing Shabbat. Many Jews express their Judaism or their Jewish identity through their Zionism. And why is that important? The reason that that's important is because if we're talking about a component of identity, then, and that's what Zionism is, then anti-Zionism, and I'll say this, you may hear and have heard from people, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. And so again, the reason that this definition and this understanding of Zionism as a component of Jewish identity is so important is because when someone says, I'm anti-Zionist, what they're saying is not, I disagree with Israel or the policies of Israel or something like that. What they're actually saying, and they may not know it, but again, if you're educated and you understand what Zionism is, then you can help educate them. What they're actually saying when they say I'm an anti-Zionist is that I do not believe that the Jewish people have the collective right of self-determination in their ancestral homeland, that they don't have the right to have the nation, the state of Israel. Everyone else on the planet, fine with that, but not for the Jewish people. And when we understand that Zionism is a component of Jewish identity, and someone says I'm an anti-Zionist, then that's discrimination in the same way that other forms of anti-Semitism are discriminatory, because what someone is saying is that I think that Jews should shed some component of their identity, right? This is not particularly specifically the religious component of Jewish identity. This is the national ethnic component of Jewish identity. And Jews are protected by non-discrimination laws on both bases. And so this is really what we're talking about when we talk about anti-Zionism as the new anti-Semitism and as a form of discrimination against the Jewish people. I also want to be really clear that this collective right of the Jewish people to exercise self-determination in Israel, it's not a new thing. It didn't begin because of the Holocaust. This is some 3,000 years old, this right of the Jewish people, right? It didn't begin with the Holocaust. In fact, I've heard it said, and I think it's a good way of putting it, is that that Israel doesn't exist or have the right to exist because of the Holocaust. Instead, the Holocaust happened because Israel didn't exist. And so again, that just really informs the importance not only of the state of Israel, but of understanding this definition of what is Zionism. And so understanding the discriminatory nature of anti-Semitism, including anti-Zionism, is going to be important as we continue to talk about some of the other topics. So I want to talk a little bit about some of what we're seeing right now in the midst of the corona pandemic with regard to anti-Semitism, some of the unfortunate examples. And I want to put it in again, in a free speech framework, because I think that will help a lot of people. And I want to back up for just a second and say that one of the things that is kind of a primary objection for those who don't particularly like or support the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, one of the primary objections is based on, it's an erroneous argument, but on a free speech argument. And the claim goes that if you look at some of the manifestations, the examples that are given, that those violate, here in the United States, the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Nothing can be further from the truth for this reason. It's merely a definition. It's a tool to help define and identify when conduct may be anti-Semitic. Nowhere in a definition is there, in this one in particular, is there any enforcement mechanism? Is there any mention of silencing the type of speech that may be considered anti-Semitic? And so it's a frustrating argument to me, because I think we have a really easy time when it comes to most other people groups recognizing language that is discriminatory, that is bigoted. There are certain words that that are not used in polite company because we understand that those are discriminatory and bigoted terms. No one is saying that you can't use those words, right? No, and no one's being punished for using those words or that language. It's simply defining it as racist or as bigoted, whatever it may be. And so this definition, the IHRA definition, is no different. It's simply a tool for helping to identify when certain conduct or speech may be anti-Semitic. Doesn't say you can't say it. In the United States anyway, for the most part, people have a right to use bigoted language. No one's trying to silence it. We're just trying to identify and call it out for what it is. And that's why I think this is a really important definitional tool. So the reason I say that is because, again, I want to put some of the current situation into a legal construct here, into a legal framework, and specifically in terms of free speech, hate speech, and discriminatory conduct. Those things kind of all go together when we talk about these issues. So again, this is where I'm going to kind of focus in a little bit on U.S. law. So the way that things work in the law is there's a general rule typically, and then there are exceptions to those rules. Well, so the general rule here is the free speech clause of the First Amendment, which just says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. There's other language in there that doesn't have to do with speech, but that's it. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And that Congress obviously means the federal Congress, but it also now includes any state actor, state governments, local governments, things like that. So the government cannot abridge the right to freedom of speech. That's the general rule. And so unless speech falls under some exception to that rule, it is generally protected by the First Amendment, again, protected against government infringement. So one of the exceptions, and the one that I want to talk about for a minute, is incitement. And so if speech is classified as incitement, and when I say is classified as, that typically has to come from a court, but there are court rulings that we can use to kind of look at and say, okay, that speech sounds like it would fall into the incitement exception or wouldn't. And so to help us understand whether speech may not be protected by the First Amendment. And again, the reason we're going through this is because we're going to look at some examples in a minute of what we're seeing and hearing right now. And I want to talk about those in this framework in terms of whether they are or are not protected speech, because again, a lot of times, we understand that here in the US, generally, people have a right to express bigoted and discriminatory views, but not always. And so some of what we're seeing, I think, is pretty clear in some of these instances that it falls under this exception. So what is incitement? It's just speech or advocacy that is directed toward producing what's called imminent lawless action, and that's reasonably likely to produce that action. So I think that's a fairly clear definition, right? It's just if you are trying to get someone or a group of people to engage in imminent lawless action. Imminent means it's going to happen, it's likely to happen very soon. You've given details maybe of the who, what, when, where you want, to happen. And that whatever that conduct is that you are inciting or trying to produce in the very immediate future is against the law. So let's look for just a second at some of these examples, again, of what we're seeing in the midst of the corona pandemic, specifically as it relates to anti-Semitism. So here in the top left, you've got a picture, and we're going to talk about this situation more in a minute, but this is a picture of a gentleman who works at a Toyota service station, and there was a situation in which he made the comment to a Hasidic Jewish man that he was responsible for spreading the coronavirus. So that speech in and of itself is probably protected, right? Again, in the US, and maybe not in all countries, but in the US, generally people have a right to express bigoted views. And so to tell a Jewish man that you think that he's responsible for spreading the coronavirus. Probably protected speech. Doesn't make it any less anti-Semitic, but it's probably protected. Then over on the other side of your screen, this is actually talking about a situation this is the one I really want to focus on for a minute, and that is that white supremacists, white racially motivated violent extremists is what they're called by the government, have been communicating much more frequently since the corona pandemic has intensified about what they're calling an obligation among themselves, if one of them should contract the virus, that they view it as an obligation to spread that to their quote enemies. And there's a list kind of ideas of how they should do that. Spending as much time in public places as they can amongst their enemies, even things like spraying their saliva on handles and on buttons in elevators. And the two populations that they are primarily targeting are law enforcement. And while this document says minorities, the chatter apparently is largely talking about not just law enforcement, but Jews. So this is one of those situations, clearly anti-Semitic, no question about that. I think we can easily see that that's, calling for the aiding or harming of Jews, no question that under our definition of anti-Semitism, this qualifies. The question, though, is that protected speech? Well, in this instance, I would say, no, I don't think it is. I think it's in fact entirely incitement, because this is people calling for the harming, the unlawful action of communicating a disease intentionally to someone else, which is against the law. And so it's not just saying, I'm going to do this, which is bad enough, but this is calling upon other people, a large group of people, to engage in imminent lawless action. And I think it's fair to say that the people that they are talking to, when they're talking amongst themselves, that it's reasonably likely that they're going to take each other up on these recommendations. So again, I think that this is a clear example of not just anti-Semitism, but of incitement. And so again, my position would be that there's absolutely nothing protected about this speech. Certainly the conduct itself, were it to happen, would be unlawful. Another thing that we're seeing more and more of, especially in the last week or so, I've heard and read a lot more reports about, here we are sitting on a Zoom meeting, and so far so good. It's secure, but not all of the Zoom meetings that are happening are so secure, and particularly a lot of Jewish groups are experiencing situations where it's kind of similar to what we see on campus a lot of times with event disruptions, where anti-Israel activists come in and disrupt whatever the speaker of the pro-Israel student group might be. So instead, now that everything has gone to online meetings, we're seeing a lot of disruptions of these Zoom meetings, especially Jewish groups. And what's happening is people are hacking into these Zoom meetings and disrupting them, and engaging in anti-Semitic slurs, and the conduct itself is probably in most cases against the law. There are laws about cyber stalking and harassment and things like that, and so it may very well be that that's the case, and the speech is clearly anti-Semitic. Again, no question, that the types of things that are being said. And so this may be another example where there is potential legal consequence, because if they're targeting individuals on purpose, and again, depends what they're saying and what they're doing, but these are situations where, like I said, there may very well be violations of cyber stalking, cyber harassment. Again, if they're directed at specific individuals. Each state has its own laws about what qualifies as harassment, and so these are case by case kind of situations when we're analyzing them. But the reason that I think that this is important is because a lot of times we hear about anti-Semitic speech, and I think so often we get frustrated because it seems like there's nothing that we can do about it, because we do have the First Amendment. And again, I love the First Amendment. I think it is one of the greatest things that the founders of this country did. But it can be very frustrating when bigoted and discriminatory and harmful speech is protected. And again, it seems like, well, we're kind of helpless here. I do think that in the current circumstances, what we're seeing, people are for whatever reason, they are bold enough right now that they are crossing lines and they are violating laws. And so there's very real potential that there could be some enforcement. And in fact, with regard to the situation we're about to talk about here with the gentleman at the Toyota Service Center, there actually already has been some action by the government. So, excuse me, let me see if I can. Okay. I'm sorry, before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about why this happens. Why are we even dealing with this situation? And really what it has to do with is the same thing that it's had to do with for millennia, and it's scapegoating. And I think that this is actually a fairly true statement, that a good scapegoat is nearly as welcome as a solution to the problem. And so I think first, again, if you can't tell by now, I'm a definitions person. I think it's really important that when we talk about a topic, we know what do the words even mean that we're using. And so again, most of us probably are fairly familiar with what scapegoating is, but just put really simply, it's blaming someone or a group for either your own wrongdoings or for a problem that you don't have an answer for. And it generally, unfortunately, ends up resulting in feelings of prejudice or bias against the group or the individual who's being blamed. And so this is a technique that, again, is used especially in modern times when people don't really want to be very introspective and they don't want to look at themselves as a possible cause of a situation, or they don't have an answer. And I think right now we're seeing that that's the state of the world. We don't have an answer right now for not only what's happening exactly, but how long is it going to last? How many people are going to be affected, impacted? What's the world going to look like when this is all said and done? I mean, it obviously looks vastly different from what it looked like a month ago for all of us. And so without answers to some of those questions, it's very easy to be looking for someone to point the finger at. And historically, we know that this often ends up being the Jewish people. And for individual situations and problems, as well as for societal situations. And so I think that it's important that we remember that this is not a new tactic. This is something that has been done, again, for thousands of years when it comes to the Jewish people. The Jewish people have been blamed. You can see, I think from these images that for starting wars or for interfering with wars, causing a certain side to win or lose. There's blaming Jews for being, as this one image says, behind race mixing. And then, even things very kind of close to home right now, this is not a new phenomenon. Jews have been blamed for causing diseases in society, including the Black Death. So again, nothing new under the sun when it comes to scapegoating the Jews. And so what we're seeing in the coronavirus pandemic, again, it's the same reason that it's always been. It's a scapegoating tactic, and these are just some examples of Twitter examples, as well as some cartoons, memes. One of them I think is kind of small, and so you may not be able to read it, but there's a hand holding a couple of vials of blood, just a medical image with a couple of tweets. One just says, "The Jews invented coronavirus," and the other one says, "Nice job, Israel, creating the antidote after creating the disease." So this is just kind of emblematic of what we're seeing as a mentality. There's another one here that a woman posted, actually calling out some anti-Semitic scapegoating when a JetBlue flight attendant told this woman that the coronavirus was spreading because of dirty Jews. And so thankfully she actually spoke up and says, I don't remember ordering blatant and disgusting anti-Semitic rhetoric with my ticket. How will you respond? Over on the right, there's an image of a tweet that is sharing a notice that went out after the APAC policy conference. And it was just because there had been some individuals there that they later found out, excuse me, had been infected or had been exposed to, rather, the coronavirus. They wanted to make sure that everyone who attended was aware of that. But this individual shared that and says, here we go, straight from the horse's mouth, coronavirus to every last hidden corner of the USA, courtesy of Jews. Again, there's no basis for that. So again, that's clearly a scapegoating technique and blaming the Jews. And then you see, if you can see this in the bottom left, there's an image of a Trojan horse with the head of it being the coronavirus. And then inside the Trojan horse is a Jewish caricature along with a globe. And so again, just the idea that that Jews are responsible for the spread of the coronavirus throughout the world. So again, these are just examples that are unfortunately becoming more and more prevalent of what we're seeing online. So sorry, before we get to this, I do want to go back and I want to talk about the Toyota Service Center example, because excuse me, I think it's a perfect example not only of conduct that violates the law, it's anti-Semitic conduct that violates the law, but I think it shows the scapegoating very clearly. So what happened is that a Hasidic Jewish man went to a Toyota Service Center and he had a pre-scheduled appointment. And so when he arrived, he was told that, so sorry, excuse me, he was told that the service center was closed, although he was, clearly seeing that other people were continuing to receive service. And so he was confused by this and asked to speak to someone and said, I have an appointment and, I need to get service. And he was told that he would not be receiving service and he asked why, and was told that because he was spreading the virus. And so he asked this employee, why am I any more likely to be spreading the virus than anyone else? And of course, there was no answer given. He was just continued to be told, you need to leave, you need to leave. So this is entirely based on nothing more than the employee seeing this man and identifying him by his appearance as a Jew. And thankfully, there are laws in place that make it very clear that places like this, places of public accommodation, are not permitted to refuse service or to discriminate in any way based on various protected classifications, including religion. So a clear example of anti-Semitic conduct. Thankfully, the Attorney General of New York very quickly got involved, did an investigation, and has been staying on top of this. Actually sent essentially a cease and desist notification to the service center to make it abundantly clear that this conduct is in violation of New York law and shouldn't continue. And so, to our knowledge, that has not recurred. But this is obviously something that that we have to keep an eye on. And we're seeing it. We're talking about it right now in the context of anti-Semitism and the treatment of Jews with regard to coronavirus, but Jews aren't the only ones who are being scapegoated and mistreated. And obviously we're seeing the same thing happening with the treatment of Chinese people. And so obviously the same kind of thing, treatment, if that were to happen to Chinese people, that would equally be a violation of the law. Okay, give me just a second here, and I'm going to try to share my screen again because I'm not sure that it's working for you guys. And I apologize if that is the case. Just a second here. All right. And think we're back. Just gonna see if somebody will give me a thumbs up so that I know that you guys are seeing this. All right, so what you should be seeing right now, I hope it's working for you, is anti-Israel campus activism amongst and amidst the coronavirus. So we've talked about what's happening kind of in the community and some of the issues that we're seeing there. But there's also still things happening on campus, even though campuses are basically closed at this point. As I said earlier, anti-Semitism isn't taking a break, even on campus. And before I get into that, I do want to just talk a little bit about, again, why does any of this really even matter? I mean, yes, I'm sharing information with you. I'm sharing with you some of what we're seeing, the spike in anti-Semitism and the way that it's currently manifesting itself. But there really are kind of three main reasons that I think we need to be aware of these things. One is to publicly expose them, right? So when you see others sharing this kind of content online, in particular is where we're seeing a lot of it right now, we need to use our voices to call this out, to clearly identify it as anti-Semitism. Again, I go back to the definition that it's extremely helpful. The IHRA definition is extremely helpful in that regard, to be able to point to, this is happening and this satisfies, this particular aspect of the definition, or this is one of those examples that's been given of a potential form of anti-Semitism. And so again, just to be able to call that out, to expose that for what it is and for why it's wrong. Again, we talked at the beginning about the fact that anti-Semitism, and we talked about anti-Zionism, that these are clear forms of discrimination. And so if we readily acknowledge that that racism is discrimination, right? That misogyny is discrimination, that anti-LGBTQ activity is discriminatory. If we can readily identify and call out those things as being problematic in society, then we've got to be able to do the same with anti-Semitism. And so again, that's why I say we have to be aware of this so that we can expose this. We also need to be reporting it. There's a lot of anti-Semitic activity that's happening, again, as I've noted, that either clearly does or may very well violate the law. And even if it doesn't violate the law, it may violate the policies, say, of the social media platform that we're seeing it on. And so, again, it's really important that we are all monitoring this specifically so that we can expose it publicly, but also so that we can report it if that's appropriate. And one of the things that we know is that there's strength in numbers. And so while, yes, these platforms should be monitoring for themselves as well, they do rely on individuals from the public to make them aware of content that is objectionable. And then, they can review that. And while, yes, ideally, anytime that they get one of these reports, they should be looking into it. But the reality is that the larger, the volume with regard to a particular posting or some particular content, the more likely it is that they're going to actually take that seriously. And so I think it's really important that that we all be aware of that. And so I actually want to switch my screen here for just a second. I want to talk about a tool that that we have created, and let me see if I can get over here. Excuse me. All right, so I'm now on the, I'm going to go to you two different places on the Stand With Us homepage. So that's what everyone should be seeing right now is the Stand With Us homepage, and you see the Stand With Us Connect. Over on the right here says we've got a place to report an incident. And so if I click on this, and my internet works for me. Let's see. There we go. And again, the reason I'm doing this is I just want to kind of show you, I want to walk you through how this works. Let's see. And I'm not sure that you're seeing it. And I apologize, for some reason this is not working for me. There we go. All right. All right, I'm going to stop the share and start it again because that doesn't seem to be working. And I'm sorry, guys. Okay, so again, what you should be seeing now is I went to the Stand With Us homepage and I clicked on Report an Incident, and this form popped up to report an anti-Semitic incident, right? And so you fill in your name, your first name, your last name, your email, your telephone number, and then you let us know what type of incident is it that you're reporting. Is it an incident that was directed at you personally? Is it one that was directed at someone else, a third party, or at property? Or, and this is where I want to focus, to report online anti-Semitism. And so if that's what's happening, and again, that's what's happening right now, largely because we live in a virtual world. And so most of the anti-Semitism that we're seeing is happening online because there's just not as much interpersonal interaction. So to report the online anti-Semitism, if you click that radio button, what automatically pops up here is a box where you can select the website where you observed the content that you think was anti-Semitic. And so you pick that, and then say it's TikTok, then this is really the beauty of it. And this is what I wanted to show you, is that not only are you going to be giving us a description below of what it is that you've seen and found problematic, but you can actually click the link here and report it directly to that social media platform. And so that's where it really matters. I mean, we're going to take that information and we're going to be able to share it, with all of our members, with all the people who are following us and who sign up for information from us. But you are going to be able to report it directly to this social media platform. And then again, those who get the information from us and want to join, and we really encourage you to do that. If you get that information from us, just because one person saw it and reports it doesn't mean that they have to be the only one. And that's where I'm talking about the power in numbers, so that we can make sure that that as many of us as are willing to are reporting this to the social media companies. All right, so and then again, this is what I'm talking about. You can actually click down here to receive updates from Stand With Us and from the Center for Combating Anti-Semitism. You can also opt into, we're creating a WhatsApp group so that you all can stay in touch with us on ways to fight online anti-Semitism. And so I just want to really quickly show you that you can also do that same thing. You can go to standuptohatred.com. And that's the Center for Combating Anti-Semitism's website. In the same way that we just walked through that, I won't walk through it again, but you can click on File a Report, and that same form is going to come up. And so you may have noticed here there's a blue box, and I want to focus on that real quickly. We're going to be kind of wrapping up our discussion here in just a few minutes. I want to talk about an initiative that Stand With Us has recently launched. And again, if you don't follow us, you may not be aware of this, but I think it's really important that everybody be aware that this is happening. So we are partnering with the Mizell Family Foundation. And what we're doing is we are offering reward money for individuals who come forward with information that they provide to law enforcement if that about attacks against Jewish individuals or their property. And if that information ends up leading to the arrest and conviction of someone for an anti-Semitic hate crime, then there is a monetary reward that we are offering to the individual who brought that information forward. So really just trying to incentivize people being alert, aware, and then actually using their voice and coming forward and being willing to provide that information to law enforcement. So this is a really important initiative that we are working on. It's a very involved process on our end, but on the end of the individuals, like I said, really simple, really just need people to be vigilant. And again, eventually life is going to resume and there's going to be more interpersonal interaction. And unfortunately, based on what we're seeing online, I think there's a reasonable expectation that some of the physical violence and assaults that we were seeing, especially in certain locations before the pandemic really hit, we may see a spike in that afterwards, again, because of the scapegoating and the anti-Semitic rhetoric that is rampant on the internet right now, and that's what people are doing. That's where they're spending their time. And so to not be realistic, in expecting that the way that people treat one another afterwards when we're all together again may reflect some of that. I think that's a very realistic expectation, and so we need to be prepared for that. And this is an initiative that we hope will be helpful in incentivizing people to come forward with information. There's so much more, just to be honest with you. I hate that this is the reality. There's so much more that we could talk about in terms of anti-Semitism and how we're fighting it. We are obviously using the legal tools at our disposal. You may be aware that we have a current Title VI complaint against UCLA, and I won't go into the details of that there right now, just because we need to wrap up. But that information is available on our website, and essentially it's Title VI is just a tool, like some of the others that we talked about, for making sure that public funds are not going to institutions that are discriminating. And for our purposes, we're obviously focused on anti-Semitism and making sure that Jewish students on campus are protected and that they are not experiencing a hostile climate on their campus. Unfortunately, that's happening right now, not so much. But what I was going to share earlier, and I will just say this, is that even though campuses are shut down, things like Israeli Apartheid Week, which we see every year, normally what we see are things like apartheid walls and physical I guess manifestations of lies being told, and posted on apartheid walls, and mock checkpoints. We see these types of things on campus. These obviously aren't happening right now because campuses are closed. But Israeli Apartheid Week is continuing, and it's just moved online. And so what that means is that students are continuing to be exposed to these lies. And then what ends up happening as a result of that, typically, is that Jewish and pro-Israel students on campus end up being harassed and end up being subjected to essentially a hostile environment. And so we just need to be aware that these things are continuing, and the spread is possibly even greater because everything is online right now. And the same way that I'm talking to however many thousands of you right now, so are they. And so, the situation afterward, when we're back in the real world, again, I think the reasonable expectation is that this is going to be reflected in what we see. And so again, being prepared to use some of those legal tools that are available to us, to use these funds for reporting criminal activity and physical assaults, reporting online anti-Semitism. These are just all really crucial tools. Wanted to just make sure that you all are aware that those are there, aware of what we're doing, and of how you can be a part of helping to fight back against the anti-Semitism that we're seeing. The last thing I want to say is I would encourage you to go to StandWithUs.com or go to the StandUpToHatred.com website. That's the Center for Combating Anti-Semitism, and look at some of our resources there, because we have things like 10 steps or 10 ways that you can combat or fight anti-Semitism, just practical things. And so right now, I think obviously we have to be mindful of how we change that for in the current circumstances, what that might look like. But it doesn't mean that we have to stop. And I think that's the key. And I want to kind of finish with that, is that we know that anti-Semitism has not taken a break, and that means that we can't take a break. And so I just want to leave you with that encouragement that we are continuing to combat anti-Semitism in every way that we can right now, and just appreciate everyone for tuning in, for listening to this, and encourage you to find ways to work with us to make sure that we continue to fight back.
So thank you so much, Carly, for this informative and important live webinar for Stand With Us Connect. And thank you again for supporting our mission to stand up for Israel and fight anti-Semitism around the world. So I've been monitoring the webinar and the Facebook Live questions. We have people tuning in from literally around the world, from the US, from the UK, from Israel. We have a Talia Levi Shalom from Stockholm, Sweden. We have Martin McNabb Shalom from Northern Ireland. We have people from Switzerland. So extremely excited to have you with us. So thank you so much. I want to start with the questions that you've posted. The first question actually it goes as follows. In your view, is fighting anti-Semitism just a Jewish issue? Are there allies in the fight?
I can answer that really easily from a personal perspective. I would say no, it's absolutely not just a Jewish issue, and I say that because I'm not Jewish. I don't fight anti-Semitism because I'm Jewish. I fight anti-Semitism because it's wrong, and there absolutely are allies in many different contexts, whether it be a religious context. You know, there are Christian allies, Hindu allies. We have, you know, other nations that are very supportive, just in general, of the Jewish people. So yes, we have allies in many different contexts in society, and you know, we have the saying, we say this a lot. You know, you may have heard this. You know, that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And the reality is that I think the best way to encapsulate it is that anti-Semitism, not so far from being only a Jewish problem, it's a societal disease. And I think if we look back at history, there's just no question that when anti-Semitism begins to rise, we start to see the degradation of many aspects of society. And so it's clearly not a strictly Jewish problem. It's a societal problem, and that's why we need the allies, and that's why we're so grateful that we have them.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Harris Burnson. He says, thank you, Carly, for your great words. Why do you think that it appears that prosecutors, mainly US attorneys, don't pursue actions against individuals or groups that put out anti-Semitic literature or make problematic speeches?
I think there are a number of reasons for that, a few reasons for that. One, as I said, largely in the United States, anti-Semitic speech is protected by the First Amendment. And so the government a lot of times doesn't have the option to silence it. Again, that's where non-discrimination laws, though, come into play, because, for example, you know, I mentioned our Title VI case against UCLA. While the speech that's at issue, the things that were being said about, you know, Israel being a racist endeavor, things like that, Zionists being equated with white supremacists, that speech generally may be protected speech in most contexts. And UCLA, as a state actor, maybe they can't silence that speech because they're bound by the Constitution, by the First Amendment. But that doesn't mean that federal funds have to subsidize that speech. And so that's where these other types of laws come into play. And so it's not necessarily prosecutions, but there are legal tools that are available to address anti-Semitic speech, you know, when it occurs. I think that's probably one of the largest reasons that you don't see prosecutions of these types of things. But as we talked about earlier, when that speech crosses the line and it becomes harassment or incitement, you know, I think that those are the types of situations that they're few and far between. So that may be why we don't see a lot of prosecutions for those things. But when they do happen, at least right now, thankfully, we are seeing that government actors are at least taking note. And I suspect that, you know, for example, this Toyota service station situation, if that were to recur, I think we would see prosecution. And then the last thing I would say is, I think part of why we may not be seeing prosecutions is, we talked about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And while it is an international consensus definition, it needs to be adopted throughout the United States, in all states. I mean, this is something that all governments need to be consistent in saying, you know, we understand what anti-Semitism is, we have a definition for it. And so that's also something that we're working very hard on, is to make sure that each state in the country has this definition codified into law so that there is consistency.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I have an interesting question actually from Panama. Someone says here, thank you, Carly, for this opportunity. We have lived in Panama in peace and accepting society up until now. Since the Corona crisis, there have been lots of incidents with double standards on social media. For example, people would take pictures of Jews on the streets and spread that we are not committing the lockdown, and a video of 100 people of a Jewish wedding, for example, also spreading Corona all across the country. So my question is, how should we respond to those generalizations and posts? Or should we respond at all? Should we just leave it? What's your answer for that?
Yeah, that is tough. You know, I think in terms of whether to respond or not, I think that it's a case-by-case kind of a situation. Depends what's being said. I certainly think that if what's being said qualifies as anti-Semitic, that, you know, the idea that, you know, Jews are getting together and that's causing the spread, then, you know, I think that needs to be called out as, you know, a scapegoating tactic and, you know, and identified as anti-Semitism, because others who are seeing that may not understand that that's what it is. So I definitely think for the purpose of exposure, those are things that perhaps it is a good idea to respond. You know, and the reality is that the focus exclusively on Jewish gatherings, for example, you know, that you're right to recognize that that's a double standard, because there are plenty of people who are still getting together for various reasons in groups. And so I think that that's the important thing. And I mean, I just would say that you hit the nail on the head with that, is calling it out, not only as having anti-Semitic content to it, substance to it, but also that there's a double standard being applied. And again, these are the things that I think it's really crucial that we use our voice to expose, so that others who are seeing it understand what the problem is with that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot for this. I want to take a moment and acknowledge the side of legal department. And you've mentioned different partners, that you're working with other partners and people who support you. So to what extent, and this is kind of a general question here, can anti-Semitism be fought by utilizing the law? I mean, how do you work on a daily basis? Can you explain to us a bit more?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's some of what we've already talked about. For example, we make sure that we're aware of the various legal provisions that are at our disposal. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one of those. And as I mentioned before, it's a non-discrimination law that essentially says that if you're receiving federal funding and you engage in discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, and that creates a pervasively hostile environment for members of, you know, of a community, whether for us, it tends to be on campus, you know, so we're dealing with the education department of the government, but, you know, there are various other agencies that enforce Title VI in different contexts, but those federal funds can be taken away if that type of discrimination occurs. And so again, for us on campuses, when students are being subjected to anti-Semitic discrimination, and that ends up being, you know, a problem such that they can't fully participate in the activities and in the programs on their campus, that's a problem. That's a pervasively hostile environment, and that's a situation where you know, we use Title VI, we file a complaint, we have, you know, we ask the Department of Education to investigate that and make sure that remedial measures are put in place. And so again, that's just one example. But it's a big one. But then there are also, I'll give another example of a situation, a way that we've used the law in the past. You know, when there are demonstrations, for example, generally public demonstrations, generally those are protected by the First Amendment. But not always. When they become disruptive, that's potentially a violation of the law. And so when there are event disruptions, say, of pro-Israel speakers, you know, standing there and chanting for a minute or so, that may be fine. But if you substantially disrupt and don't allow an event to continue, you know, then we have laws that are available, you know, state laws, federal laws that we can enforce. And we have done that, again, on campus with students. We've also done it in community situations. So those are just a few examples, but that's, I mean, that's what we're doing on a regular basis, and that's, I have to go back to the reporting tool. That's part of why that tool is so important, so that we're aware of situations that need that may need, you know, to have the law brought to bear on them. And so again, can't emphasize that enough, that's just a really crucial tool so that we can continue to do this and make sure that people's legal rights are protected.
Okay, thanks a lot, Carly. I want to take you to a different question. I guess some of your viewers are asking that question. It's a general one. Barry Werner is asking here, is supporting the Palestinians anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Barry Werner is basically asking, if we support the Palestinians, is that anti-Semitic? I mean, is that anti-Semitic or not? Yeah.
No, and that's actually a great question, and I'm really, really glad that it came up, because here's the reality. While you know, we talked earlier, we mentioned earlier the BDS campaigns, you know, things like that we deal with on a regular basis. Pro BDS individuals and factions would have people believe that it's a zero-sum game, that you can only support one or the other. You either support the Palestinians or you support the state of Israel. And again, that's just it's a farce. You can absolutely support the Palestinian people. And I want to be clear, we're talking about the Palestinian people. The leadership of the Palestinian people, that's a different issue. I don't think that you can in any way support terrorists, Hamas, or even the policies of the Palestinian Authority, and at the same time, support the state of Israel. I don't think those two work really well together in general, but absolutely, there's no reason that you cannot support the Palestinian people and at the same time support the state of Israel and the Israeli people and Jewish people in general. So, I think that's a great question, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to address it to such a large audience.
So interesting insights. Thank you so much, Carly. That was a great way to end this webinar. I want to thank you once again for joining us and participating in the Stand With Us Connect webinar. Now, before we wrap, I want to tell everyone again, if you love the work that Stand With Us does, you can donate and support us however you like and whatever you can at standwithus.com/donate. If you enjoy the session, again, you can book a private webinar for your community, for your church, for your synagogue. Just go to standwithusconnect.com. You don't want to miss this. We're having actually another webinar tomorrow on Stand With Us Connect with Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who will be speaking about emerging from crisis together. Our full program, if you're interested, is at standwithusconnect.com, and we look forward to seeing you once again. If you can't come to Israel, we'll make sure to bring Israel to you. I'm Tamir Oren, live from the Stand With Us Connect program. Shalom, and see you next time. Bye.